Good afternoon, and it's wonderful to see all of you in the room. I know many of the people in the room, and I look forward to meeting those whom I have not yet known during the course of it. Just briefly about myself, my name is Rick West, and I am a local now, actually. Um, I am a citizen of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes in the state of Oklahoma. I am a member of the Society of Southern Cheyenne Peace Chiefs. I'm the president and CEO emeritus Native Ambassador of the Autry Museum of the American West, and am the director emeritus and founding director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian. And I'm glad to see all of you here. What I had been asked to do was to sort of oversee the part of the program this afternoon that relates to sort of the combination, if you will, within the bounds of the theme for this seminar of the subjects of returning objects to Native communities and some of the work that ATALM, the organization that has just held its annual conference out in Palm Springs, are doing relating to the same subject. That is what I will try to do. I was asked to make remarks which are entitled Returning Native Objects and Cultural Patrimony, Strengthening the Good Red Road, is how I've entitled what I would like to say to you. And when I finish that, we will proceed to other parts of the afternoon's program. So we will start. When Steve, Aaron, and Joe Horsecapture asked me to deliver remarks in the nature of a valedictory for this year's Marshall McKay seminar, I was rather instantaneously intimidated. I have seen the illustrious roster of participants for this year's event. I despaired candidly about what I might add that has not already been fully analyzed in addressing the theme, going home, returning material culture to Native communities. Given my longitude as a museum director, however, I decided to muscle up as best I could to trace what I believe are the profound change-making threads of that worthy theme. My maiden voyage in the museum field was as the founding director of the National Museum of the American Indian, and it began a full generation ago, within months after the enactment of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990. Now, in the autumn of that career, as a member of the Board of Governors of the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums, I am honored to serve as the chair of one of the repatriation movement's offspring, namely ATALM's important current initiative, the Going Home Fund. There are vital and undeniable linkages between the two, NAGPRA and the Going Home Fund. They sit squarely in the same museological matrix and serve as context for transformational changes in museum practice. I want to focus on that connection with you this afternoon as valedictory to what you have discussed so ably and with such heart during the past 2 days. But I want to do so in a very particular manner. Tempted as I might be, with my law degree at the fore, to immerse you in statutory prescriptions and legalisms, I have no intention of deploying that approach solely. I am a, yes, you can clap, that's all right. I am a native octogenarian who has directed museums and overseen large native collections for more than a quarter century at 2 different institutions. What interests me most and what I choose to leave with you today is a strong sense and sensibility of the tangibles and intangibles of a larger schema. That context touches and defines broad and enduring shifts, changed museological paradigms, and dramatically altered philosophies and attitudes of museum practice that have undergirded and inspired Native communities and museums at long last to send Native cultural objects home. Let's then turn to origins and begin at the beginning with NAGPRA. I want to start our journey by quoting the prescient words and wisdom of a dear friend and colleague of mine at the NMAI and the Smithsonian Institution, Elaine Hoyman-Gurian. She served as the NMAI's Deputy Director for Programming and probably has forgotten more about 21st century museum best practices than I yet know. But here is what she said in 1992. The American Indian claims, in their persistence and in their assertion and reliance on the creation and prosecution of law, have been the most visible catalysts for the current industry-wide reappraisal of museums as social institutions. For this pressure, all of us, even in our most fearful and anxious states, should be grateful. We will, I believe, learn more about museum possibilities in the next decade, thanks to the American Indian community, than we have learned in the previous several. And museums will become different in a way that will, in the future, seem logical and self-evident. I predict that we will not be able to recreate what all the fuss was about. You and I know the bones and legal requirements of the NAGPRA legislation enacted in 1990. It requires the return after due process of Native ancestors, associated and unassociated funerary materials, sacred and ceremonial objects, and cultural patrimony to affiliated Native communities. It applied to virtually all American museums. In moral and practical terms, the tangibles of the repatriation legislation are seminal and substantial. The return of human ancestors and funerary materials was nothing less than the confirmation of a moral imperative that corrected vast wrongs committed during the 19th century when the U.S. military's battlefield sweeps sent the remains of thousands of Native ancestors to Washington, D.C. for, quote, cranial studies, close quote. In addition, the law required the return of sacred objects and cultural patrimony that had everything to do, as a practical matter, with securing the cultural future of living contemporary Native communities throughout the United States. The congressional determination, explicit in the legislative history and definitive of its legislative philosophy and spirit, was that these kinds of cultural materials should never have been in a museum to begin with. Instead, they should be returned to communities in order to sustain, and in some cases to revive, sacred and ceremonial practices and to secure a cultural future for contemporary Native communities. In addition, and consistent with the spirit of this repatriation charter, implementation of the legislatively mandated legal requirements should not be niggardly. Under the law, museums were required to develop and publish inventories of a Native community's cultural materials they held. That mandate signaled an approach premised on proactivity and not reticence or delay. As a director, both here previously and at the National Museum of the American Indian, ours was an institutional approach that encouraged ongoing outreach and follow-up with Native communities whose materials we believe to be covered by NAGPRA. We wish to hide nothing under a bushel, so to speak, or to avoid making any moves before being asked to by the Native community. And a word to the wise, to museum staff, to museum fiduciaries. The foregoing spirit and philosophical approach will need to be especially in play as Native communities turn to material that is in the category of cultural patrimony under NAGPRA. It is perhaps more tender territory for museums, and in the view of some, less clear-cut than other categories of repatriation. But, and let me emphasize, it is identified explicitly, legislatively, and associates directly with revisions in recent federal regulations that call out Native viewpoint and deference to it in making such determinations. In the end, of equal importance, and to my earlier point, NAGPRA also contained profound change-making intangibles beyond its tangible substantive legal provisions. Those intangibles possess true cultural potency for future relationships between museums and Native America. They may not have been perfectly understood at the time by many parties, including sometimes Native communities themselves, but the implicit message is this: NAGPRA forever changed the fundamental power relationship between museums and contemporary Native communities. My point is not limited to the return of Native material and objects, as important as that provision is. I always considered that requirement only the tip of the iceberg that sometimes concealed below the waterline an even larger revolution in philosophy and practice for the museum community. Specifically, the definitions in the museum world of terms like authority, authenticity, and expertise. Questions such as who has knowledge and cultural authority? How do museums define interpretive expertise? Who are the experts entitled to sit at the table of museum interpretation? Were profoundly and enduringly altered. Those alterations have completely revolutionized 21st century curatorial practice in America's museum communities, and I will say not just limited to those museums that have Native collections. No one captured more eloquently and accurately this seminal power shift and the transformative changes in the classical museum paradigm, its philosophical underpinnings, and the resulting museum best practices than a person who most certainly should have known. Namely, my first boss at the Smithsonian Institution, the late Secretary Robert McCormick Adams, himself a distinguished anthropologist. Here is what he described the NMAI at the very time it was being created, and shortly after I had arrived as its founding director. This is a national museum, he said, that takes the performance, the authenticity, the vitality, and the self-determination of Native American voices as the fundamental reality it must represent. We move decisively from the older image of the museum as a temple with its superior, self-governing priesthood to a forum committed not to the promulgation of received wisdom, but to the encouragement of a multicultural dialogue. And a final point concerning a specific bone I have to pick with certain sectors of museological thought, but I feel very strongly about it. In 2002, a document called The Declaration of the Importance and Value of the Universal Museums defined a, quote, universal museum, close quote, as, quote, an institution that serves all humanity. The declaration further describes, quote, global objects, close quote, as items that are not considered to belong to, quote, a single country or people. Others more cynical than I have charged that the declaration was primarily a device to establish immunity from claims to repatriate objects or materials from their collections. So let me stop short of being accusatory and say simply that institutions like the National Museum of the American Indian and the Autry Museum of the American West are not emphatically universal museums where matters of the repatriation of Native materials are involved. They well may not be global objects and indeed may belong to a single people. Any other result would be a violation of federal law in the United States and possibly a breach of the Code of Ethics of the International Council of Museums. The foregoing represent the transformative impacts of the repatriation legislation, both its literal legal requirements, as well as its far broader consequences for 21st century museological thought and museum practice. Let me now turn to that equally seminal and inspiring descendant I referred to earlier, the ATALM's Going Home Fund, which I am privileged to oversee, along with others, as a member of ATALM's Board of Governors and the chair of the Fund's Advisory Committee. I will state its broad mandate now, as you will be hearing more specificity in presentations that follow mine. The Going Home Fund's mission is clear: to support the return of cultural objects and materials to Native communities on a voluntary basis from museum collections, private collections, and other sources. ATALM believes in the paramount importance of these items finding their way home and being reunited with the people to whom they rightfully belong as the communities of cultural origin. We want to foster partnerships and raise greater awareness so that this mission becomes an international priority, grounded in mutual respect and shared responsibility. As the title indicates, the fund is beyond repatriation and even beyond museums. While it is about returning cultural objects to originating communities, it serves a far broader purpose, a far deeper purpose. While it provides the financial support that has prevented the return of cultural heritage, it also stimulates awareness that Native communities are ready, willing, and capable of caring for their own cultural materials. Returning cultural materials is thus an act of restorative justice, a step toward healing, and a reclamation of heritage that extends beyond objects and back to people. The fund is intended to build bridges over the troubled waters of past collecting practices that were plainly colonial in origin and practice. Over those bridges, cultural objects and other materials will be brought home, and cultural continuity for many Native communities will be enhanced. The ultimate aim of the Going Home Fund is not a return of things, and instead, and far more profoundly, constitutes an effort to support, on as broad a basis as possible, the restoration of living Native cultures and a secure Native future. In closing, beyond the words I have shared with you this afternoon, their message and essence were captured perfectly in far fewer words than mine by a favorite Native poet of mine, Simon Ortiz of the Pueblo of Acoma in New Mexico. I wish to honor him by speaking his words here. Simon was writing of his own personal quest for cultural survival as a contemporary Native person, but he well could have been speaking collectively for all of Native America. It doesn't end, of course, he wrote, in all growing from all earths to all skies, in touching all things, in soothing the aches of all years. It doesn't end. Simon's statement is not mere beautiful rhetoric. It is not gratuitous. It is culturally real. It is a plea and a demand at the same time that the abiding legal and ethical foundations of America's repatriation laws and undertakings like ATALM's Going Home Fund remain honest and true, that Native cultural objects and patrimony should sit closest to those places and peoples where their meanings and histories are deepest and forever abide. May it ever be so, and thank you for your kind attention. And now, if I may, I would like to proceed to some of the next speakers, and two of them are coming to us virtually. And those will be, and I'm not sure whether are they combined into the same video? Yeah, okay. And those are, the participants are Shane Bushyhead Condell and Evan Mathis. Now, Shane Bushyhead Condell, Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, is a citizen of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians and a PhD student at George Mason University. He currently serves as the executive director of the Museum of the Cherokee People, the Tribal Museum of the EBCI. Condell has worked in the museum and cultural field for over 20 years and is committed to cultivating Native representation and self-representation in public spaces. And the second participant is Evan Mathis, Eastern Band of Cherokee's descent, serves as the Director of Collections and Exhibitions at the Museum of the Cherokee Peoples. Mathis is an artist of Cherokee descent with close ties to the community. He graduated from the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, with a BA in history and is currently enrolled in the Museum Studies Certificate Program at the Institute of American Indian Arts. And I will rejoin you after we have seen it.
Gio, my name is Shayna Bushyhead Condell. I'm a citizen of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians and currently serving as the director of the Museum of the Cherokee People, which is the Tribal Museum of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, located on the Kiowa boundary in Western North Carolina. Evan?
And I'm Evan Mathis. I currently serve as the Director of Collections and Exhibitions here at the museum.
We wish so much that we could have been with you at this host conference about the Going Home Fund and ethical repatriation. But unfortunately, our schedules didn't align, so we weren't able to do that. But we are so happy to be able to join you this way. So we hope you enjoy what we have to talk about, what we have to share, because we think this program is incredibly important. So just a little brief history about the museum. We were founded in 1948, which makes us one of the oldest tribal museums in the country. And we were founded on a collection built by a white businessman for tourism. And what was going on in Southern Appalachia at that time was that manufacturing was drying up, logging was drying up. And so when our community was thinking about ways of putting food on the table, tourism was one of those things that rose to the top. And we're always really grateful for the forethought of our ancestors because they fought for the entrance of the new Great Smoky Mountains to be on the Kiowa boundary. So we get about 3 million visitors that pass by our doors every day just as a result of that. And a little bit of history about the museum too is that we had a fire in 1953. And fortunately, the collection was housed elsewhere, so that was saved, but a lot of the provenance for our objects was lost in that fire. In 1976, our community came together again to rebuild the museum, and it came along with the movement, a larger movement for tribal museums in the 1970s, as well as a means of economic development for communities. And that's the museum that we're in today. And if you've ever visited us, you would recognize. And then in 1998, there was a renovation of the museum that is the permanent exhibit that we currently have. I think one of the things that we want to talk a little bit about is that we have recently, since I arrived in 2021 and you arrived
December 2021.
Yeah, so it's been recent that we've undergone a change, and we worked on our mission, vision, values, and spent a lot of time thinking about all of that and what resonated with who we are and what we want to be today, but also what kind of a museum we want to be in the future. We were also able to do a rebrand and change our name from Museum of the Cherokee Indian to Museum of the Cherokee People. That was also integrated with a logo rebrand that Tyra Maney, our amazing designer, was able to come up with and put intention in every little bit, from the color to the iconography. Every bit of it represents who we are as Cherokee people. And so in doing that, the point of that was thinking about who our audience is and who we serve. And that concept has run through everything, every element of what we do. And when I arrived, we didn't necessarily have a dedicated collections division at the museum. And so that is where Evan comes in. And Evan was hired to do that. And he can speak a little bit about kind of what our thinking is as we move forward with that.
So like Shayna said, I joined the museum team in December 2021. Prior to me working here, there was no collections division. And the museum, as far as we know, had never had a collections policy within that time. And it also did not have a collection scope, which is incredibly important for any museum that is collecting. Unfortunately, because we didn't have a policy or a scope, we wound up with materials from literally all over the globe. Although our collection scope seems incredibly obvious because we're the Museum of the Cherokee People, it wasn't clearly defined. And so any materials that were offered to our museum were accepted in the past. And having a way to say no to donors is really important sometimes. And to be very clear on what your intentions and what your collections is and what you want them to be is very important. So now that we have a collections policy and a collections scope and all of these materials that are not Cherokee, we're working really hard to identify source communities to figure out where these materials should go and where they should live. Shayna and I think our whole team really believe strongly that descendant communities are the best stewards of their own cultural materials.
So for those of us that work with Native collections, I think we can all agree that the hardest part of our jobs is when we have to go into collection storage and see our objects in these shelves, knowing that not only were they probably collected in a way that we wouldn't love, but also that there are likely ancestors in those collections. It makes it really difficult typically to go into those spaces. And so for us, I think it is really important when we looked at our collections and we saw that we had objects from other communities that we knew that even though we have a heart to care for them, that we knew that they wanted to return home.
And I'll say too, it can feel like your community's objects are being held hostage in these institutions, and we never want to be guilty ourselves of that. And so, of course, it makes total sense for other communities' objects to go back home to them where they can be best cared for, like we said.
And it felt overwhelming, I'll say. Like when Evan finally got through the inventory of objects that we had that were not Cherokee, it was overwhelming to consider how we get them home. And we had some beautiful, amazing objects, and just trying to think about how, would we pay for shipping and how would we take the time to, box them safely and make sure that, they're cared for. And
what language do they speak?
Yeah,
we didn't
exactly.
even know how to contact some of these people.
That's right. Yeah. And so I think for us, becoming involved with the Going Home Fund was just an incredible blessing, an answer to prayers, and thinking about how we would even begin to take that first, proverbial bite out of the elephant. And so, Evan, I think you can speak a little bit too about like what that process was like and what we hope for.
Yeah, and so when the Going Home Fund was first announced, I think the original intent, as I understood it, was that there are all of these people, individuals that hold materials that they would like to gift back to tribes. And when I first heard about it, I was like, well, we have the opposite problem where we are a tribal museum that is holding these materials, but we don't know how to get these things back home. And so I reached out to Susan Feller, who's the president of ATALM and the Going Home Fund, and I was like, we have a really unique opportunity here where we have materials in our collections already that need to go to other tribal nations and other indigenous communities literally throughout the globe. And she was, of course, very amenable to that and wanted to help our institution out as well. She kind of recognized that we were trying to do the right thing just as much as these individual owners of material heritage were as well. And so it made a lot of sense to shift where the Going Home Fund was originally intended to go.
And we're lucky we've had, we had a major success right off the bat with a gorgeous Kiowa cradle board that was in our collection, and we admired it and knew that we wanted to reach out and figure out who it belonged to and where it should go, and having their guidance in that whole process was amazing. And those of you that attended ATALM last year were able to see that object return home, not only to the tribal officials who attended, but also to the family. And that was really meaningful, I think, too, and of course, Evan, one of the big assets he brings to this position is his network of friends that he has throughout Indian country. And so being able to reach out to some of those folks and realize that we could see the name on the back was just incredible.
Yeah, so with the Kiowa cradle board, that object was transferred to our museum from another institution because we are an Indian museum in the Southeast. Like Shana said, we were the former Museum of the Cherokee Indian, and there's not very many federally recognized tribes here in the Southeast that people recognize easily. And so because of that, I think that's another reason we wound up with other tribal nations' material culture. And with the cradle board in particular, so there's no records of it ever existing in our collection. It was never accessioned. It was sitting on a shelf when I started. And I got it down and started investigating. And I was, I'm not an expert on plains beadwork, but I could tell that it was from the plains. I could tell it was from the southern plains. And fortunately, I have a really close friend that is enrolled Comanche Nation. And I reached out to her, and her parents came in and viewed the cradle board, and there were a pair of moccasins that were from the southern plains as well. And they looked at it and they said, it looks similar to our stuff, but we think this might be Kiowa. And so to help me out, they got me in touch with the Comanche Nation's TIPO, and they in turn got me in touch with the Kiowa Nation's TIPO. They did review the materials and all the photos and everything, and they did all agree that it was Kiowa. And then the day that we were packing the cradle board up, our education program manager, Chanel Feather, she came in to view the cradle board. I thought it would be interesting for her to see it because she has multiple tribal backgrounds, and some of her heritage is from the Great Plains region. And she also has a really extensive network of people that she knows. And so as many eyes as we could get on this object, we wanted to make sure that it, people know that it's happening. We lifted the cradle board up, and it was in really good light in here. We had never done it in here for some reason. We always had it out in the changing exhibit space in a temporary storage location. We lifted it up, and you could just barely see that there was writing on it. And Chanel is the one that recognized that. And it actually had the maker, or the cradle board, it had the baby that the cradle board was made for and the date written on the back of the cradle board. And I kind of freaked out because I was like, I can't believe that that's present. And so I immediately texted my friend Jordan Poorman Cocker, who is a really well-known Kiowa curator, and it wound up being her cousins. So she was able to immediately let the family, the exact family that the cradle board was made for, know, and they actually got to be present at the repatriation.
So cool. I mean, you just know, you could feel that this cradle board, knew that we were trying to help, and so seeing the information get revealed and, that all the dominoes kind of fell in the right order, and
it was all by chance.
All by chance. Yeah. And it's just, it's really powerful. So we're grateful for that, and for the Kiowa graciously accepting and coming and being so supportive, and we're just so honored to be able to return it home. And then we were lucky to have folks come and help us with more. And so, we'll continue to do this, and I think that experience was really cool for our staff because they were able to come here.
So cool. Yeah.
we were really excited that the folks from the Going Home Fund were able to like actually come here on site. And I think it was really meaningful for us and our staff.
Yeah, so we got to work directly with Susan Feller, Melissa Brott, Jeannie Braco, and Jack Towns.
Yeah.
And they were all professional conservators. They also provided all of the materials that we needed to build custom blue board boxes to create safe housing for these materials.
Which is not cheap, those of us who are building boxes now.
Yeah, and so truly without the Going Home Fund, we would not have been able to afford to do this project. As you can see, none of our collections have been housed in blue board boxes or archival boxes ever in their history. So this is a major burden that was that they provided relief for us for.
That's right. And I think like the skills too that our staff was able to pick up from them on, you know, even object handling and building of boxes and that kind of thing is also super helpful as we think about moving our collections hopefully soon to a new offsite collections facility, and we can take some of these ideas and concepts and apply them into our work as well, which is super exciting. So we're just grateful for the opportunity. We're also grateful to be able to speak to it. I think it's just the beginning for us, and you know, the skills and knowledge that we've gained over the past year have been just incredible. So if we can ever offer assistance, we always want to be able to do that too. And yeah, thank you so much for allowing us to speak with you all. I think what Evan said earlier, I just want to reemphasize that we know that the best people to care for their objects are the home communities. And I think when we are, as tribal museums, as acting as examples, we can hopefully inspire even other larger museums and institutions and universities around the country to do the right thing and think about repatriation not as simply the letter of the law, but as what it is to be a good person in relation with this world.
And if I could encourage each of you to please visit the Going Home Fund webpage. All of our materials that are up for return are listed on that page. If you see materials that are from your community, or if you recognize something that maybe is from another community that you have contacts in, we do have really good networks, but we don't know everyone, and we need all the help we can get to get these materials back home.
Absolutely.
So, and also our collections is all, not all, but mostly digitized. So if you want to utilize our website, we want all Cherokee people and all people in general to utilize our website. But there's a lot of Cherokee materials on our listed on our collections, and there's also all of these other tribal nations. Their materials are still on our website as well until we're able to complete the transfers. So
yeah,
definitely check out both of those locations, and we would appreciate any help you're able to provide in helping us getting these materials back home.
Absolutely. Yeah. So have fun in LA. We miss you all and wish we were with you, and appreciate you listening. Shki.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rick, for your great words. Thank you, Shanna and Evan, for the video. And I know Ben is a little disappointed he didn't get to hold up his 5 minutes left sign, but what can you do? In the video, they did mention Jordan Poorman Cocker, and we're lucky to have her today. She'll be our next presenter. She's an Indigenous artist, curator, and scholar from the Kiowa and Kingdom of Tonga. Poorman Cocker investigates interconnections between Indigenous research methodologies and Indigenous museum practices by linking relational worldviews to art. She is currently the curator of Indigenous art at the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art. Please welcome Jordan.
Deonde Babon, Deonde bats an dom toya koi makan toy bogo paddle tico beko nado and malo at lava. My name is Jordan Poorman Cocker. I'm Curator of Indigenous Art at Crystal Bridges and NAGPRA officer. I also now serve on the Going Home Fund board, as well as the NASA board, and teach at the Institute of American Indian Arts MFA and Studio Arts program as an artist mentor. I'm so thrilled to be here today and to talk a little bit about this Bondop. So I'm going to do a little language class with y'all. My grandma Dolores has taught Kiowa language for many years, and the correct way to say Kiowa cradle board is Bondop. So I'm going to say it, and then I'm going to turn time over to you to say it. Bondop. Not bad. I am so glad that Shayna and Evan spoke a little bit about the journey of this cradle board, this Bondop coming home. And I received a text from Evan probably a few days before ATALM was over. And he mentioned that we're trying to get a hold of our of the Kiowa Tribal Museum interim director, who is Dr. Phil Dupoint. And can you help us out? And so I called Uncle Joe. I called Amanda Hill, who's our TIPO and a relative, and he was not well. He wasn't feeling well, and said, "This is important. Can you come out and take care of this?" And I said, "I'm in the car right now. I'm gonna head over." So, you know, it means a lot to have these items come home. And while this isn't a sacred item, in terms of being sort of culturally sensitive and ceremonial in nature, it is so important because Bondop is tied to our Kiowa children. And this cradle board was made by the Onco family for Ruby Ella and her grandniece, Anita Onco, who is a relative, came out to ATALM to receive the cradle board with us, which was so special. And, you know, I think a lot about the work of repatriation and return and just sort of the historical context that's connected to that period of colonialism and salvage anthropology when items were removed, intentionally removed, and then the items were displaced and the context was erased. I thought Henrietta's comments about the intention of those acts as really creating a form of violence and humiliation was wonderful because it described the feeling and the experience of having something removed. And so if we know that colonialism removes items, people, humanity, context, evidence as an act of violence and humiliation, what does it mean to return something? What does it mean to restore connection across time and space between descendants and those tangible items? So just in terms of that context, I wanted to share, and we can go to let me see if I can handle my clicker. Yeah, here we go. So I descend from Kiowa cradle board makers, Kiowa beadworkers. So the picture with the four figures is of my ancestor, Baigigo, her sister, and then the smiling one is Padotai, and her daughter, who is pictured as an elderly woman in the other image, is Alice Poorman Paddletea, Toibo. So these cradles were made and still are made for the smallest members of our society, the polio, so the little children. And they're so invaluable. If you have little children in your family or in your camp, you're regarded as wealthy, you're regarded as rich, because the children are our future. And so these cradle boards were really created with intention to place this child in society, in that little rabbit society. And so even in their first year of life, you know, these cradle boards are made within a family unit. So there wouldn't be just one maker, there would be multiple makers. And the time would often take the full 9-month gestational period. And even as an item, banto, these cradle boards were designed to help the baby to develop as a human being in the first year. So the system, vestibular system, which is responsible for spatial awareness and balance, is developed in that first 9 months. And with fine motor restraints that the cradle board provides, it helps the child to develop in a good way. So my aunties and my grandmothers will say children that go on the cradle board have less anxiety, they have less depression, they sleep longer, they're more settled. So there are all these benefits to creating these cradle boards that, again, are still being made today. But to have one come back from the period of removal and the period of, just after the time that our treaty was signed was amazing. It was incredible. And when I got that text, I was overjoyed because I think I shared with Evan and Shayna, this is the reason that I entered the field, to bring these moments of not just the connection through object making and all of the learning that will now proceed in our communities on, specific beadwork techniques and putting these items together, but also that intellectual kinship and maybe the healing that can happen in communities when the things that were removed intentionally to humiliate and harm and create this violent ripple effect come back. So I just wanted to sort of share some of that context around Kiowa cradle boards and how invaluable they are beyond, how valuable they are to us. So these images are of the cradle board. There were tender reunions between descendants and this cradle in person. And there was a song that was sung when we were in that holding room in the hotel to the cradle by my mom, Deborah Cocker. And it's a song that's sung to children when they're small and you're sort of soothing them. And it was really special. And so I felt honored that, I had the privilege of being there and sort of honored to be invited to help facilitate those connections between the tribe and the Going Home Fund in this return. And our tribal chairman, Chief Spotted Bird, mentioned in his remarks how important it is and how tender it is to have this item returned to us. Again, thinking about those little children and the most vulnerable among us, but also, something that we talked about over dinner. And I'm grateful to Christina Burke, who attended dinner with us. Something that we talked about was thinking into the future. And that is really the intention behind Bantop. One of my aunts, Vanessa Mopope Jennings, said that cradle boards are created to carry a child into a world that sometimes as mothers or grandmothers we will never see. And the benefits and impacts of that reunion are, they're deep. And so, but at the dinner, I think something that came up was that because our tribe is somewhat short-staffed, and I think many tribal nations are, we needed some support from Christina Burke to transport the cradle back to Carnegie, to the tribal headquarters. And so she was able to sort of literally go the extra mile and do that, which was very helpful in realizing that return. And just sort of in closing, and I want to keep it brief, as I mentioned, our children are the heart of the nation, and even when they're born, they have a little society, little rabbits that they can go into, polio. And even though, the Onco family received this cradle board back, and you can see Mrs. Onco, she's in the hot pink shirt in the center, and she brought her descendants with her. That family is part of a clan, so we're all part of the Ulso Redstone clan. and grassy eaters, or Kate. And then those clans are part of tribes. And I think the more opportunities that we have to, support this work of return beyond repatriation, the better our communities will be, the stronger that will be, and we'll be able to better face the challenges of today. So again, I want to express my gratitude to the Mellon Foundation for their vision and support in helping this work to come to fruition, and for all those who had a hand in this return. So, aho, thank you. Yeah.
I just noticed, and this is I think I've done this a few times, how I'm kind of segregated way over here to the side. Anybody notice that? Okay, so great presentations. I have a lot of comments. I think Jordan, I think the first one, since you did the most recent one, is probably for you. I think it's interesting, and I'm wondering, as I say, how this makes you feel, is, on one side of your work, you're curator, right? And then just sort of by happenstance, you received a bondo, am I saying that right? Bondope, a bondope that is created by your relatives. So in the way you're kind of seeing both sides of that, and I'm wondering how do you process that?
That's a really good question, and it's not quite by happenstance. I was raised to think about what it means to carry things, items, ceremony, songs, knowledge, for our collective. And so I think when I actually was inspired to go into the museum field, it was when I was going to university in New Zealand. And for the first time, growing up in Oklahoma, I saw there that Natives were not just janitors in the museum, but they were directors and curators, and you could go into a space and come out, and this isn't, I don't want to romanticize what's going on there, but, relatively unharmed to an extent. And I don't think they always get it right, but it really was a place of social learning and connection. And I was inspired by that. And so I think the decision to go into the museum field was driven by the disconnect between our communities and our material cultures that are in museums.
And I think a part of your presentation for me, in the way, sort of brings us back to the beginning, is what is cultural patrimony? And if you recall, when I read the official definition, it said something that was inalienable from the community, doesn't belong to a individual, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the way that you describe the way these are created is you're created by multiple people within the family. And it is in a way those blessings that go to the child. Then that child, as it grows up within the community, passes those blessings on as their responsibility of being a citizen of that community. So in a way, and I am not a lawyer, nor do I portray one on TV, but in a way, it is cultural patrimony. Am I interpreting that correctly?
I think that there's definitely a Venn diagram of of definitions going on. But I, similar to the presentation that was given about the shield yesterday, even though there may be direct descendants to the makers, and of course to who the bond dope was made for, it is meant to be seen in our society, and it's meant to be passed down as an heirloom. So when it was interrupted intentionally, and it wasn't just, this is a great example of that humiliation that, General Pratt and other folks who took Kiowa, Comanche, Apache, and Cheyenne warriors to Fort Marion. That humiliation, I mean, it was moccasins, it was shirts, it was pipes, it was tobacco bags, anything and everything that could be taken. And it reminds me of, what happens when you go to prison. All your possessions are taken away to dehumanize you and to sort of create this dynamic of power. But in that, I guess, going back to that sort of construction and patrimony, I think I said this to my table. We were talking about that term, and it's sort of a tough term because I think of like the opposite side of the coin. It would be like an item of matrimony. I don't know. I think there are a lot of layers to those definitions, but really, it is up to the tribal nation to decide what is and what is not cultural patrimony.
Rick, do you have a perspective on that?
I think I would say the very same thing that's just been said. I guess with my lawyer's hat on, I would say that what the new regulations have made quite clear is that there is considerable deference that has to be paid to the tribe's own construction in answering that question. And I think that I don't rule out that it may vary from tribe to tribe and be sort of on a case-specific basis. But and I was not here, unfortunately, I just got here this morning, and so I didn't hear the previous discussions. But the way that Jordan just described it, it really is something more than just an individual family object, if you will, that it sits in a matrix that is bigger than that and has other layers of meaning to the community. And I know that's complicated, but it will have to be sorted out. And what I do believe is a bottom line matter I referred to in my remarks, and that is that what the regulations have now made clear is there is viewpoint coming from the native side that has to be taken seriously. And I think in the past, what I would say on this and other kinds of questions where there was native viewpoint, I think the feeling by the revisers of the regulations was, and the comments that led to those revisions, is that that kind of viewpoint was not taken as seriously. And so I think it has been put in a position just in terms of description in the regulations where it must be taken more seriously.
So Rick, for your presentation, I thought it made me think of several things, actually. How you emphasize, particularly with NAGPRA and sort of the directions, maybe many museums are moving because of the law, and as well as priorities for the different institutions. Talk about the preference for native viewpoint, native knowledge in interpreting works, objects.
Mm-hmm.
So what is the relationship between native knowledge and curators in museums? How would they work together?
Well, they shouldn't be seen as in opposition. I mean, one of the other underlying theses of what I was saying is for a moment pull back, if you will, just a little bit from the explicit provisions that were in about the return of certain kinds of materials. My larger point is, I think, a contextual one. And that is that as far as I'm concerned, and I did try to refer to it at least briefly in the comments that I made, one of the most significant aspects of the repatriation law is it basically upset the apple cart in ways that are terribly significant for the future, because it literally altered, certainly in the context of returning objects, but in other ways too, the balance of power between museums and Native communities. And I think that that's just very, very important to keep in mind. And so its impact on museums, which does have to do with curation and curators, is that it, just as in repatriation, it's the projection and the value of first-person Native voice. So it should be throughout the museum, and that includes specifically the curatorial side of the museum. And in both the NMAI, I dealt with your dad on this subject, and then I dealt with you on this subject at the Autry, and fortunately, you're both consistent with each other, so there was no problem. And that is
Hopefully consistent for the better.
yes,
Okay, good.
absolutely. And so the point is that just as repatriation relies on first person Native voice, so should interpretation and representation. And so there should not be a clash. And I think in museums that have really worked it out, they've worked it out either by, at long last, hiring Native curators who sort of bring the matrix with them when they come, just because they are Native, or even in those who are not. It is simply, I think, in 2024, vastly different than it was in 1990 in terms of the attitudes of non-Native curators and how that whole process works now.
So if we can focus on your presentation regarding the Going Home Fund. So we saw from Shanna and Evan the example of the Museum of the Cherokee People with the Bond Dope. And that's just one example out of this vast, vast network of possibilities of return. They're not only from museums for voluntary returns, as opposed to NAGPRA, but also from private collectors. So for our various audiences, I mean, it's, you know, I've been associated with the Going Home Fund for a little bit. And how do we just get our heads around all of this? Because it's so, the possibilities are so vast.
They are, but that's a plus in the end, because it shows it is complicated and a complex matter to embrace much larger territory, if you will, beyond the requirements of repatriation itself. But it shows you, I think, where things are going. That is where they're headed. And it may take us a little while to figure that out. I think the ATALM, through the Going Home Fund, was as interested in trying to model certain kinds of things or explore paths and processes to try to get this done, as it was in being the perfect model from the beginning. I do invite anybody in the room to explore on the website of ATALM this particular project, because literally everything we are now dealing with is up and there, with the exception of objects that may be, the view may be limited because of our perceived nature of the object, but otherwise everything is there. And what we've tried to do is first of all get the objects up and make it publicly known that we can be a clearinghouse for that kind of thing, and then to assemble a cadre of everybody from curators to conservators to collections folks, et cetera, whom we can bring to bear in trying to figure out the objects we get and assist in getting them back to where they should be. And we have dollars as well as people as resources to try to help in that process. But that is what it is going to take, I think. But it is something which is in full swing right now, I think. The progression is really toward more liberalism and liberality in this transfer of objects coming from private collectors and beyond. to trying to figure out how to get them back to the tribe. It's much more open territory than it was certainly when I became a director in 1990.
And just to speak to that, I mean, having the right folks on in these positions to make the connections is everything. I was so appreciative again of Christina Burke offering to drive the Cradle Board to Carnegie from Oklahoma City because we're a small tribe and we don't have the capacity at that time. We didn't have the capacity and still don't to, transport that bond dope. And so, having flexibility in the process was absolutely critical to that success.
Yeah, I think you'll find it's both the people and just the tasks of transporting any kind of native, especially native objects, which are sort of inherently fragile because they're often organic material and et cetera, et cetera. And so just the process of packing and transporting can be both complex and expensive. And for some tribes, they simply don't have the resources to do that. And museums sometimes don't either or aren't willing. And we are willing. And we intend to do that. And we've put more money into the project even since it started at ATALM to try to heavy up the financial support we can lend to tribes in that regard.
So for the parameters of the Going Home Fund, earlier we had, yesterday, we had our presentation that objects are either given, trying to come back to the tribe, either voluntary or through NAGPRA, but they don't necessarily have a place to store them. Is the Going Home Fund cover sort of that end of it? Or is it more of facilitating objects coming to the tribe?
Well, go ahead. Did you want to say something? Yeah, no, what I would say is that here's we do require that there is some suitable place to which the object can go. Now that depends upon what the object is. I mean, that may be one thing, one place, and sort of another thing, another. But what I will say is that there are instances when the tribe simply doesn't have it doesn't have a museum or a cultural center. And there, what we have tried to do is figure out any number of things, and it causes museums themselves to think somewhat differently. For example, large museums normally have, but not any in which I have ever sat, collections management policies that restrict what they can hold to that over which they have title, period, nothing else. And, we changed the collections management policy at the NMAI so that that was not the case. So sometimes it may be a case where it may not go physically back to the tribe, but title is transferred and we provide some kind of housing for that. Or it may be that in the area where the object is returning to geographically, there's another tribe that can assist. But we're trying to explore those possibilities which help solve that kind of problem too.
Okay, great. Questions from the audience? Really? Oh,
There's one.
please.
Kind of a silly question, but I was just curious, where would you repatriate objects from groups that are no longer around, such as pottery from the Anasazi Indians? Where would they be repatriated to?
I have one answer. You can take a first shot if you want them.
I think that's a good question. The process of consultation is important. Identifying, source communities takes time. And for, works that are historical, and predate removal periods and predate the designations of even tribal nations as we know them today, having a discussion with a conglomerate of nations is imperative to really open the door for listening and sort of taking in the recommendations from the TIPOs and other cultural preservation folks, the staff.
I think that's true. One answer would be, and I don't mean to be flip at all, I'm not sure that contemporary Pueblo tribes would necessarily agree with the statement you made, that there is no place a pot like that can go in contemporary communities. So that's one answer. The other, though, does play exactly on what Jordan said. And we found this in repatriation, but there's analogy, I think, to how you would handle it through the Going Home Fund, and that is listening and consultation. Museums have have not been fantastic about listening sometimes, but they're getting better at it, I think. And so what we did, where there was an analogous kind of problem with respect to material that was being repatriated, where there could be multiple claims to it, or were multiple claims to it, is we listen. And quite frankly, we normally let them figure it out. Often they wanted us to figure it out, the museum. And we said, no, we're not going to do that. It is you who must figure it out. And we ultimately succeeded every time with that. Took a while to make it work, but it does. So the process and listening and consulting astutely and widely, I think, is a big help.
Any other questions from the
But a
audience?
good question.
Oh, there we go.
Actually more of a question for Jordan, partly because of the experience in New Zealand. So my feeling from a European perspective is that Te Papa was a very successful institution in arguing for and successfully for restitution, particularly about settlement remains. And I wonder if you had a way of, now that you're doing this work here and that you witnessed the work in New Zealand, what do you think are some takeaway points that you think might be helpful in international context?
I think that's a great question. The first repatriation that I had the privilege of playing a small role in was I was working with Grace Hutton, who is Kaitiaki Taonga, collections manager for Pacific Collection at Te Papa. And it was the return of a Ahu'ula cloak that belonged to Chief Kamehameha to the Bishop Museum. And it took a number of years. So it actually didn't come to fruition during my placement there. But what really inspired me about that space was seeing the policy and the practice in action. And I think it continues the work that's happening in New Zealand. It's at Te Papa and across the country continues to inspire me because I think it's a great example of how Indigenous people can utilize sovereignty in a way that really does the work of indigenizing colonial institutions and museums. And in terms of what it looks like to be informed by those policies and practices, as a practitioner, I think is really focusing in on the processes and the steps that were taken, as well as the policies themselves. So something that I incorporate into my work as a curator are practices that center sovereignty. And to center sovereignty means having an understanding and working with folks who have an understanding of the treaty. So Te Tiriti o Waitangi sort of is really the skeleton of the structure of the policies that we see emerge from New Zealand. And here in the US, we rarely hear folks talk about whether they're, Indigenous or not, the treaties, but it's in those laws and bylaws that we really know what is ours to have claim on and stake claim on and take action towards having more autonomy and authority over and maybe what isn't. And oftentimes it's actually quite open-ended. And so I think the more that Indigenous communities here, including my own, the more that we take authority of those treaty rights, the better these sorts of conversations will be in the coming years.
Can I add something? Yeah, if I could add something, Henrietta, just sort of invoking sort of the other half of my experience as a museum director was spending a lot of time on ICOM's executive board and being an officer in the organization. And I'd make a couple of points. One is that the ground is generally shifting a bit, I think, even in Europe. And not to get too personal, but I remember when Joe's father, George, and I visited the then Musée de l'Homme in Paris. And you don't mistake George for being native. I'm accused frequently of being an Italian businessman. And so he and I were making our way through the Musée de l'Homme, and we were never more than a foot behind the collections or ahead of the collections manager. I swear they thought we were going to lift something right off the shelves as we were going through. It's not quite the same now. I think that the Te Papa, which I'm a great admirer of, I sort of followed that museum from the time it was in the open harbor in Wellington to the time that it was actually operating, because I wanted to see that as a model of how that kind of thing was done. They did almost act as you, I think, implied on a legal basis. I mean, there was a treaty, quite frankly, and the fact was that they whooped the British badly. And there was some perverse respect, I think, for Te Papa when they were making those kinds of claims. So there's that. And then the other thing, just around the edges, you see things that are happening differently. When I was the director at the Autry, the president and CEO of the Autry, I was approached on a confidential basis, which I think is okay to disclose at this point, by the Annenberg Foundation, because the Annenberg Foundation had put itself in a position, and I won't describe exactly how it happened, but in the position of itself putting up the cash to bid on the casinos that were being sold in Paris. And this was 5 to 10 years ago or so. And so there are a number of ways to skin the cat, and you will find allies now that you wouldn't have found then. But I think you also will find that overall, the last thing I would add is that it's the legal committee, I guess, you might know better than I, of ICOM is now chaired by an American. And I know that we and some others I know have been working with that legal committee as they do their revision of the ICOM Code of Ethics to try to tighten up things. On that end too. There have been provisions, 3 different provisions relating to collections, exhibitions, etc., in the ICOM Code of Ethics since 2007. But now there is more focus on restitution and repatriation. And we have been in touch and have been asked to comment on some things which that committee is trying to do in redoing the ethics code.
Any other questions?
Thank you. Lily Jen and Melissa Shagnon, and with the MAI. I have a question about, there's a lot of talk about how museums and institutions are catching up with this, right? And that where the times are changing, and everyone in this room is really excited about this. But I wonder too that if this is like work of repair, what responsibilities do museums and institutions have to our communities to facilitate like a good transfer, to facilitate mediation? I was as recently in a conversation that was casual and I don't think it was meant to be so offensive, but someone had mentioned how involved do we get in with family squabbles, you know? And I think to myself, it's like, well, what's colonial disruption that caused those squabbles? So in what ways and I guess sort of even just top of mind, what sort of things do you guys think that museums can be doing to mediate that process and create repair, you know, for our communities to become more whole?
And you should too, but here's one thing I would like to say. Museums have to get themselves to the point of not doing these things in enhancing communications with tribes just because just because they know they have to obey the bloody law. They need to go much more distance in building kind of mutually respectful and substantive relationships with tribes. That sits at the very bottom of it. Forget repatriation for a moment. The fact is, most museums don't have anything but that relationship with tribes at the present time, and they need to have something different. And if I will say so simply because I know more about it because I was there, but the Autry has gone to the point of having a formalized memorandum of understanding that has substance to it, in addition to anything relating to repatriation, about how we conduct the relationship, how the Autry conducts its relationship with the Tongva and other communities in the LA Basin area. And and then I, at the moment, sit on the board of the Denver Art Museum, which has gone to great lengths because that is another city in which there's a large urban Native community to build up a relationship, a connection, where the Native community actually looks to the institution for assistance and support and help in dealing with issues that may be kind of museum related. But it's just cultivating relationships that have more breadth and depth and are not only hanging on the hook of repatriation. I mean, they must do that because they have to. But if it could be something more than that, which is much more mutual and much deeper in terms of the number of ways in which they link with each other and support each other in a mutual way, that's much better.
That's a great question. And I think really rethinking the roles museums play is integral to this work, and having a museum leadership and board that supports rethinking, you know, about museums as a temple to museums as a repository, that it's really meant for education and for social benefit. And I think the similar, you know, deconstruction of the ways that the role of the curator, moving away from the role of authority and that sort of institutional voice, and really thinking about how to incorporate facilitation. So, you know, use the word dialogue and consultation, but really that means being in one way or another in relation, and hopefully good relation with people. But if we don't have folks in these positions who either have the experience or have the ethical frameworks or the methods to take the time to speak with people and, you know, get into community with people, then that poses huge challenges to the success of that work. And something that I think in terms of the roles of museums is a really great question, and a very broad question. But if in what I was told is that if something takes 150 years or 400 years to be off kilter, and 150 years of harm and colonialism, then it's going to take as long to repair. So we think about the work that we do as sort of generational or one step towards something better. And then again, that sort of goes into the responsibility that museums have to recognize that Indigenous folks are not a monolith, and what works for one community is not going to work for another community. And there's specificity to the objects that are repatriated as well, and different levels of sensitivity. And hopefully, as Rick mentioned, more museums include the voices and work of Indigenous curators and scholars in those processes.
Any other questions? Jordan, I really want to thank you for your presentation of sharing the return of the bond dope. And I really want to acknowledge how important the Going Home Fund is. This is very much of a game changer for all of us. I would also like to thank Rick for his presentation and his leadership. And she is not going to be happy that I'm going to do this, but I'd also like to acknowledge Susan Feller, who's in the audience. Hi, Susan. She's the president of ATALM and the visionary for the Going Home Fund. So thank you, Susan. Thank you very much. Maybe we can wait for Johnny Be Good. I'm not going to do the duck walk across the stage, so not sure everybody knows that reference. Thank you, everybody, for being here. This has been such a great event. Thank you for all the presenters for coming from such a long ways away, some locally. Those of you that came from ATOM, I know it's made for an extremely long week. So we appreciate you being here. Appreciate the knowledge has been shared. Thank you to the Native Collections and Engagement Team for their assistance for this Marshall McKay seminar. These include Amanda, Karima. By the way, Amanda's also the shuttle driver and moderator as well. She's all around hand. Karima, Candy, Maggie, and Emma. This has been an epic thing to do, and I appreciate your help. It would not be successful without their work. Thank you to Ben for his assistance, and I think the relationship now between Ben and Aaron, I think Ben's going to probably be adopted into the Crow tribe. So we'll see. We'll ensure that we get video of that. Quinn, thank you very much for all the technical assistance, and Ben for keeping us on time. Laura Florio for your work in securing the funds, and our thanks to the San Manuel community for all their support with this and other initiatives. Thank you for Laura Wendell for the catering and support. And thank you to Steve Aaron, the director of the Archery. So a few years ago, I was in one of my half an hour every other week meetings with Steve, and we're like, what's going on? What are you talking about? And I said, Steve, I got this idea. I go, how about we do an annual seminar that focuses on important Native American topics? And he goes, I says, also, while we're at it, let's stream it online. Let's catalog it, have it available online. And let's also make a publication, print it out, never sell it. Instead, send it out to tribal communities and colleges. And he goes, okay. So thank you, Steve. So thank you, everybody, for being here. We appreciate your time you spent with us. As we mentioned, this has been live streamed. Thank you for the live stream people. This will also be on our website, hopefully within the next few days. Presenters, Amanda, why don't you come up here? Presenters, come up and please talk to Amanda. For those that need a shuttle back to the Hilton, Emma will stay in the back and you will talk with Emma. And presenters, please come up and talk with Amanda. And thank you very much. Appreciate everybody being here.